My daughter-in-law forced me to wear an apron and told the guests, "This old lady is going to serve us today." I smiled and accepted. The shock came when I tripled the rent. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The aroma of roast chicken filled the air as I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I stood awkwardly in the doorway of what used to be my kitchen, now Veronica's domain in the house I owned but rented to them at a fraction of its worth. My son Thomas beamed with pride as his wife flitted between guests, her laughter tinkling through the crowded living room. "Mom, you're finally here," Thomas called out, giving me a quick side hug before returning to his conversation with his colleagues. I clutched the homemade apple pie I'd spent the morning perfecting. "Where should I put this?" I asked, trying to make myself useful. Veronica's smile didn't reach her eyes as she approached. "Oh, how quaint," she said, taking the pie from my hands and placing it on a side table without a second glance. "Actually, Audrey, I'm so glad you're here. We need an extra hand in the kitchen." Before I could respond, she was rummaging through a drawer. The room fell quiet as she pulled out a faded floral apron, one I recognized from my days in this kitchen when this house was still my home. "Here," she said, holding it out to me. "This is perfect for you." I hesitated, aware of the eyes now, watching us. "Oh, don't be silly," Veronica interrupted, her voice sweet but her eyes cold as she stepped forward and looped the apron over my head. She tied it behind my back, the gesture feeling more like a shackle than a courtesy. "Everyone, meet Thomas's mother," she announced to the room of professionals in their elegant attire. "This old lady will be serving us tonight." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. I stood frozen, the apron hanging off my 58-year-old frame like a badge of servitude. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile. "Happy to help," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Thomas, caught up in conversation with his boss, merely glanced over and nodded appreciatively, seemingly oblivious to my humiliation. Or perhaps he simply chose not to see it. For the next 2 hours, I served drinks and passed hors d'oeuvres. I sliced the expensive steaks Veronica had prepared, refilled wine glasses, and cleared plates. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, but I kept my composure. Occasionally, I caught pitying glances from some of the guests. Those looks hurt more than Veronica's sharp commands. "The glasses need polishing before you set them out," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You missed a spot on that plate, Audrey." Each correction was delivered with a smile, making it impossible for me to object without seeming like the difficult one. So I nodded and complied, swallowing my dignity with each "yes, of course," and "right away." When one of Thomas's colleagues, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, offered to help me, Veronica quickly intervened. "Don't be silly, Margaret. You're our guest. Audrey doesn't mind, do you? This is what mothers do." She placed her hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too hard. "Of course not," I replied, the words ash in my mouth. Later, as I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I heard Veronica in the dining room. "Thomas's mother is just so traditional," she was saying. "She insists on helping. You know how women of that generation are. They don't know what to do with themselves otherwise." I scrubbed a stubborn spot on a casserole dish, fighting back tears. How had it come to this? The house that my late husband John and I had saved for years to buy, where we had raised Thomas with so much love, had become a place where I was nothing more than the help. When the last guest finally left, Thomas gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Thanks for helping out, Mom. Veronica really appreciated it." My son's inability to see what had happened broke something inside me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You can leave those dishes," Veronica said, yawning dramatically. "I'm exhausted from hosting. Just let yourself out when you're done, okay?" As I drove back to my small apartment that night, the tears I'd been holding back finally fell. The humiliation burned in my chest, but even more painful was the realization that my own son had watched it happen and seen nothing wrong. I parked outside my building and sat in the darkness, the engine off but my hands still gripping the steering wheel. For years, I'd swallowed every slight, excused every dismissal, all to keep the peace, to stay in Thomas's life. But tonight, something had shifted inside me. The woman who had meekly tied on that apron was someone I no longer recognized, or wanted to be. I wiped my tears and took a deep breath. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew with absolute certainty that things could not continue as they were. The morning after the dinner party, I sat at my small kitchen table with a cheesai cup of tea growing cold between my hands. The humiliation of the previous night still clung to me like a shadow, but as I stared at the faded tablecloth, other memories began to surface. A pattern I had been too blind to see. It hadn't always been this way. When Thomas first introduced me to Veronica 5 years ago, she'd been all smiles and warmth. "I've heard so much about you," she'd said, embracing me tightly. Thomas adores his mother. After John died 7 years ago from a sudden heart attack, Thomas had been my rock. For those first 2 years, he'd visited regularly, called daily, and made sure I was never alone on holidays. Then Veronica entered the picture, and everything changed so gradually that I hardly noticed it happening. The first slight was so small, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. We were celebrating Thomas's birthday, and I'd brought a family photo album as a gift. "Oh, these old pictures," Veronica had said with a light laugh. "They make the house look so dated, don't they? Maybe we should keep them in storage." Thomas had looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. And by the next visit, the album had disappeared from the coffee table. Then came the Christmas when tradition dictated that we bake John's secret recipe cookies together, something Thomas and I had done every year since he was a child. "I've actually planned a different menu this year," Veronica had announced. "Something more sophisticated than those simple cookies." The hurt in Thomas's eyes had been visible, but again, he'd remained silent. And so had I. The incidents multiplied. My suggestions for their wedding were politely dismissed. My offers to help with their new home renovation were declined because my aesthetic was too traditional. My phone calls began going to voicemail more often. My invitations to Sunday dinners were accepted less frequently, always with a plausible excuse. "Mom, we're just so busy with our careers," Thomas would explain, sounding genuinely regretful. "You understand, right?" And I did understand. Or thought I did. I told myself that young couples needed space, that Thomas was building his own life, that it was natural for a son to prioritize his wife. But now I wondered how much of that distance had been orchestrated by Veronica. The house had been another turning point. After John died, the 4-bedroom home felt too large, too empty. When Thomas and Veronica mentioned they were looking to buy a place, I offered them a deal. They could rent my house for a fraction of market value, and I would move into a small apartment nearby. "That's so generous, Audrey," Veronica had said, her eyes calculating. "But we insist on a formal rental agreement. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." At the time, I'd thought she was being sensible. Now I realized she was establishing boundaries, making it clear that despite my generosity, I had no claim to the space. Once they moved in, my visits became increasingly restricted. "We're renovating that room," or "We have guests coming later," or "Thomas is working from home and needs quiet." When I did visit, I noticed small changes that erased my presence. The kitchen I had designed with John was remodeled without consulting me. Family photos were replaced with modern art. My garden was paved over for a patio. We wanted to put our own stamp on the place, Thomas had explained when I couldn't hide my shock at seeing my beloved rose bushes gone. Veronica has a real eye for design. Then there were the comments. Little digs so subtle that objecting to them would make me seem oversensitive. That outfit is certainly comfortable, isn't it, Audrey? Veronica would say, eyeing my clothes with barely disguised distaste. Your generation just doesn't understand modern careers, she'd sigh when I asked about their work. It's cute how you struggle with that smartphone. Technology moves so fast once you reach a certain age. Each remark chipped away at my confidence, made me feel increasingly irrelevant. And Thomas never defended me. Sometimes he'd wince or change the subject, but he never confronted his wife about her behavior. I had made excuses for him, too. He was busy. He was trying to keep the peace. He didn't notice the subtle barbs. But last night, there had been nothing subtle about making his mother serve dinner in an apron while being called old lady in front of his colleagues. The realization was like ice water in my veins. This wasn't just about Veronica. My own son had stood by and watched me be degraded, and he had done nothing. The tea had gone completely cold now. I pushed it away and stood up, walking to the window of my small apartment. From here, I could just see the edge of my old house, the home, where Thomas had taken his first steps, where John and I had built our lives, where I had nursed both of them through illnesses and celebrated every milestone. The house I had practically given to them out of love. A knock at my door startled me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Eleanor, my oldest friend, standing there, with concern etched on her face. I've been calling you all morning, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. What happened last night? You look terrible. As I began to tell her about the dinner party, my voice broke. Eleanor listened in growing horror, her expression shifting from concern to outrage. Audrey, she said finally, taking my hands in hers. This has gone on long enough. Tell me honestly, how long have you been letting them treat you like this? How long? Eleanor's question hung between us. Forever, I suppose, I answered, sinking back into my chair. It just got worse so gradually. That you convinced yourself it was normal, Eleanor finished for me, her voice gentle but firm. She had known me for over 30 years, had been there through John's illness, his death, and the difficult years that followed. If anyone could see through my excuses, it was her. I spent the next hour telling Eleanor everything, each small, slight, each exclusion, each moment when Thomas had chosen silence over standing up for me. Speaking the truth aloud made it impossible to ignore how systematic the mistreatment had become. You know what the worst part is? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, if I was more accommodating, more helpful, less demanding, they would want me around. Eleanor squeezed my hand. Oh, Audrey, this was never about you not being enough. After Eleanor left, promising to check on me later, I tried to distract myself with housework. But my mind kept returning to the night before, replaying each humiliating moment until I couldn't stand the confines of my small apartment anymore. I decided to walk to the local park, hoping fresh air might clear my head. It was early afternoon on a weekday, so the park was relatively empty, just a few mothers with young children and elderly couples feeding the ducks. I found an empty bench overlooking the pond and sat down, watching the ripples spread across the water's surface. About 20 minutes later, a familiar laugh caught my attention. I turned to see Veronica sitting at a cafe across the street, engaged in animated conversation with another woman. Their table was close enough to the sidewalk that snippets of conversation carried to where I sat. I should have left. I should have walked away in the opposite direction. But something kept me rooted to that bench. half hidden by a large oak tree. "You should have seen her face," Veronica was saying, her voice rising with amusement. "Standing there in that ridiculous apron like some kind of servant." The other woman, a sleek blonde I recognized vaguely as one of Veronica's friends, leaned forward. "Wasn't she embarrassed?" "Of course not," Veronica replied dismissively. "She doesn't even realize how pathetic she looks, always hovering around, desperate to be included. It's actually sad." Each word was a needle piercing my heart. I sat frozen, unable to move as they continued. "Does Thomas ever say anything?" the friend asked. Veronica waved her hand. "Thomas knows which side his bread is buttered on. Besides, I've made it clear that his mother is a package deal. You can't have one without the other. He's seen how hard I've worked to make our life perfect. He's not going to risk that over his clingy mother." The friend took a sip of her coffee. "Still, it's his mother. Doesn't he ever get defensive?" "Please," Veronica scoffed. "I've spent years making sure he sees her the way I do, as an obligation, not someone he actually wants around. Trust me, he barely notices anymore." "So, what's your endgame here?" the friend asked, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough. "You can't keep having her serve at your parties forever." Veronica's laugh was cold. "Actually, I'm working on something better. That house? It's worth a fortune now with all the improvements we've made. I've been talking to Thomas about having his mother sign it over to us completely." I felt my breath catch. "She'd never agree to that, would she?" the friend asked, sounding impressed and appalled in equal measure. "You'd be surprised what she'd agree to just to stay in Thomas's life," Veronica said confidently. "Besides, what does she need a big house for? She's alone. We could help her find a nice little retirement community somewhere, preferably at least an hour away." The friend laughed. "You're terrible." "I'm practical," Veronica corrected. "I've put years into creating the perfect life. I'm not about to let some needy old woman ruin it now." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking away from the park. I only remember the ringing in my ears and the burning in my chest as their laughter followed me down the street. Somehow, I found myself back at my apartment, sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting bars of light across the carpet, but I felt cold to my core. Years. Veronica had spent years methodically cutting me out of my son's life, and I had let her. I had smiled and nodded and made excuses, all while she whispered poison into Thomas's ear, transforming me from his beloved mother into an inconvenience. And now they wanted my house, not just to rent, but to own. The last significant asset I had. The home where Thomas had grown up. The place where John and I had built our life together. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was Thomas. For a moment, I considered not answering. What was the point? According to Veronica, he barely noticed me anymore. But I did answer, if only to hear for myself whether she was right. "Mom?" His voice sounded normal, casual. "Veronica and I were wondering if you could come over this weekend. There's something important we want to discuss with you." My hand tightened around the phone. The important discussion that would somehow lead to me signing away my home? The culmination of years of manipulation? "Something important?" I repeated, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, it's about the house," he said, confirming my worst fears. "Don't worry, it's nothing bad. We just have an idea we think would benefit everyone." I closed my eyes, seeing with perfect clarity the pattern that had brought us to this moment. "I'll be there," I said finally, and hung up before he could hear the change in my voice. I didn't sleep that night. Images kept flashing through my mind. Veronica tying that apron around me, Thomas looking away, the pitying glances from guests, And now the conversation I'd overheard, the calculated plan to take the last thing I had. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I wouldn't confront them about what I'd heard, not yet. First, I needed to understand my position and my options. At 8 a.m. sharp, I called Martin Weber, the same attorney who had helped with John's estate after his death. His secretary seemed surprised to hear from me, but scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Martin's office hadn't changed in the 7 years since I'd last visited. The same leather chairs, the same framed law degrees on the wall, the same smell of old books and coffee. Martin himself had aged, his hair now completely gray, but his handshake was still firm, his gaze still sharp. "Audrey," he said warmly, "it's been too long. What brings you in today?" I took a deep breath and explained the situation. How I'd rented my house to Thomas and Veronica, the terms of our agreement, and my suspicion that they now wanted me to sign the property over to them entirely. Martin listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly concerned. When I finished, he leaned forward. "First, let me be clear. You are under no obligation to sign anything. That house is yours, free and clear." His reassurance loosened something in my chest. "But the rental agreement—" "Let's look at it," he said, extending his hand. I pulled the document from my purse and watched as he reviewed it, his frown deepening. "Audrey," he said finally, "this rental rate is well below market value. Have you ever increased it since they moved in?" I shook my head. I wanted to help them. "That's admirable," he said carefully. "But according to this agreement, you're entitled to adjust the rent annually. You've never exercised that right?" "No," I admitted. "It didn't seem necessary." Martin leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. "The real estate market in your neighborhood has exploded in the last few years. Properties similar to yours are renting for 3 times what you're charging." I blinked, processing this information. 3 times? "At least," he confirmed. "You've been extremely generous, perhaps too generous." The implications settled over me slowly. I hadn't just been accommodating. I'd been allowing myself to be taken advantage of in a significant financial way. "What would happen if I increased the rent?" I asked hesitantly. "According to this agreement, you'd need to provide 30 days' notice, but legally you could adjust it to match market rates." He paused, studying me. "Is that what you're considering?" I thought of Veronica's cold laugh, her casual cruelty, her systematic campaign to erase me from my son's life. I thought of my own complicity, how I'd allowed it all to happen in the name of keeping peace. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I think it's time I stopped undervaluing what's mine." Martin nodded and began outlining the steps I would need to take. By the time I left his office, I had a clear plan and a new sense of purpose. My next stop was Lillian Hayes, a real estate agent who had worked with several of my friends. Her assessment of my property's rental value confirmed what Martin had said. I could easily triple the rent and still be within market range, especially given the upgrades Thomas and Veronica had made to the house. "The irony," Lillian noted, with a wry smile, "is that their renovations have only increased the property's value, which means a higher potential rent." I spent the rest of the day doing research, making calls, and preparing myself for the meeting with Thomas and Veronica. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about establishing boundaries that should have been in place years ago. That evening, Eleanor called to check on me. When I told her what I'd learned and what I planned to do, she was silent for a long moment. "Are you sure, Audrey?" she finally asked. "This could change your relationship with Thomas permanently." "The relationship has already changed," I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. "I just refuse to see it. All I'm doing now is acknowledging reality and protecting myself." And if they react badly? I sighed. The pain of that possibility, still sharp. Then at least I'll know exactly where I stand with my son. The day of the meeting, I dressed with unusual care. A blue dress that John had always loved, pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, a touch of lipstick. I wasn't dressing for Thomas or Veronica. I was dressing for myself, for the woman I was reclaiming. I arrived at the house, my house, exactly on time. Thomas opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom, good to see you," he said, kissing my cheek perfunctorily. "Come in, Veronica's just finishing up in the kitchen." I stepped into the foyer, noticing anew all the changes they'd made. The wall color, the fixtures, the absence of family photos. It was as if they'd systematically erased every trace of the life John and I had built here. Veronica emerged from the kitchen, her smile as artificial as the flowers in the vase behind her. "Audrey, right on time," she said, as if my punctuality were a surprise. "Let's sit in the living room, shall we? I've prepared some refreshments." I followed them into what had once been my favorite room in the house, now transformed beyond recognition. As I sat on the edge of a sleek leather sofa that had replaced my comfortable old one, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Thomas and Veronica exchanged glances before Thomas cleared his throat. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something important. It's about the house." "Actually," I said, my voice steady, "I have something to discuss with you as well. But please, go ahead." Thomas looked momentarily thrown off balance, but recovered quickly. "Well, Veronica and I have been thinking. You're all alone in that apartment, and this house has so much space. We've been discussing the future, and we think it might make sense to make some changes to our arrangement." Veronica leaned forward, her expression carefully composed. "What Thomas is trying to say, Audrey, is that we think it would be best for everyone if you transferred ownership of the house to us." There it was, exactly as I'd overheard in the park. I kept my face neutral as she continued. "You don't need the responsibility of property ownership at your age," she said smoothly. "We'd make sure you were taken care of course. There's a lovely retirement community just outside the city that would be perfect for you." I allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before responding. "That's interesting," I said finally, "because I've been doing some thinking about the house myself." "You've been thinking about the house?" Thomas asked, confusion crossing his face. I nodded, opening my purse and removing a folder. "Yes, I've been consulting with a real estate agent and my attorney." Veronica's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, what about?" "The rental agreement," I said, keeping my voice even. "It seems I've been significantly undercharging you for quite some time." Thomas's brow furrowed. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I withdrew. The market analysis Lillian had prepared for me and placed it on the coffee table. "According to current market rates, properties comparable to this one are renting for 3 times what I've been charging you." The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica recovered first, her laugh brittle. "Audrey, you can't be serious. We're family, not some random tenants." "I'm very serious," I replied, my voice calm despite the hammering of my heart. "And being family doesn't mean I should be taken advantage of." Thomas leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Taken advantage of? Mom, we've put thousands into renovating this place." "Yes, renovations that have only increased the property's value," pointed out. "And while you've been enjoying below-market rent, I've been living in a cramped apartment, watching my retirement savings dwindle because I've been subsidizing your lifestyle." "That was your choice," Veronica snapped, her facade of politeness beginning to crack. "You offered us this arrangement. I offered to help," I corrected her, "not to be exploited." Thomas stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. After everything we've done?" "Everything you've done?" I interrupted, my composure finally slipping. Like having me serve your guests while wearing an apron? Like calling me that old lady in front of everyone? His mouth opened, then closed, the flash of guilt in his eyes confirming that he remembered exactly what had happened. That was just a joke, Veronica said dismissively. You're being oversensitive. I turned to her, really, looking at her for the first time without the filter of trying to please her. It wasn't a joke, Veronica. It was deliberate humiliation. Just like the jokes about my clothes, my age, my opinions. Just like excluding me from family events or rescheduling them without telling me. Thomas was shaking his head. Mom, that's not fair. Not fair? My voice remained level despite the emotion building inside me. What's not fair is hearing my daughter-in-law tell her friend that she's been methodically turning my son against me for years. What's not fair is discovering that the two of you planned to convince me to sign over my house so you could ship me off to some retirement community. Veronica's face drained of color. You were spying on me? I was sitting in the park, I replied. You were the one speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear how you've put years into making sure Thomas sees me as an obligation, not someone he actually wants around. Thomas turned to Veronica. Confusion, and the first hints of anger crossing his face. What is she talking about? Veronica's eyes darted between us, her expression hardening. She's obviously confused, imagining things. I'm not confused, I said firmly. And I'm done being manipulated and dismissed. I pulled out the rental adjustment notice I'd prepared with Martin and placed it beside the market analysis. Effective 30 days from now, the rent will be adjusted to reflect current market rates. That's triple what you're paying now. Veronica's face contorted with fury. You can't do this. Actually, I can. It's all in the agreement you were so insistent we sign. I looked directly at Thomas, the one that was supposed to prevent misunderstandings. Thomas picked up the notice, his hands shaking slightly as he read. Mom, we can't afford this. Then I suggest you start looking for another place, I said, rising to my feet. The notice period gives you 30 days. This is how you treat your own son? Veronica spat. Your own family? Something inside me broke at her audacity. Family? I repeated, my voice quiet but intense. Is that what we've been, Veronica? Was it family when you made me serve your guests like a maid? Was it family when you systematically removed every trace of my existence from this house? Was it family when you planned to take my home and send me away? I turned to Thomas, who was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. And you, my son, the child I carried, raised, loved with everything I had. You stood by and watched her treat me like garbage. You did nothing. His face crumpled slightly. Mom, I never meant... Intentions don't matter, I said, the words catching in my throat. Only actions. And your actions have shown me exactly how much I'm valued in your life. Veronica stood up, her voice rising. This is blackmail. You're punishing us because you're jealous. This isn't punishment, I interrupted. This is consequence. I've spent years prioritizing your feelings at the expense of my own dignity. That ends today. Thomas looked stricken. So what? You're just cutting us off? Your own family? The pain in his voice nearly broke my resolve. But then I remembered how he had looked away when Veronica tied that apron around me, how he had never once defended me against her cruelty. I'm not cutting anyone off, I said quietly. I'm establishing boundaries that should have been in place long ago. What happens next is up to you. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, my legs surprisingly steady despite the trembling. In my chest. If you walk out that door, don't expect things to be the same. Veronica called after me, her voice shaking with rage. I paused, turning to look at them one last time. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The door closed behind me, with a soft click that felt surprisingly final. I walked to my car, got in, and sat there for a long moment, letting the enormity of what had just happened wash over me. I had spent so many years afraid of losing my son that I had allowed myself to be diminished, disrespected, erased. I had mistaken sacrifice for love, compliance for connection. As I drove away from the house, I felt a complex mixture of grief and liberation. I didn't know if Thomas would ever understand why I had done this. I didn't know if our relationship could survive it, but for the first time in years, I was choosing to value myself. And despite the ache in my heart, it felt like finally being able to breathe. 2 weeks passed without a word from Thomas or Veronica. I kept myself busy, trying not to count the hours since our confrontation, trying not to second-guess my decision. Eleanor checked on me daily, bringing casseroles I didn't eat and reassurances I struggled to believe. "They'll come around," she said one evening as we sat in my small living room. "Thomas just needs time to process everything." I wasn't so sure. The look on his face when I'd left, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and something that might have been shame, haunted me. Had I gone too far? Had I destroyed whatever connection remained between us? "What if he doesn't?" I asked softly. "What if I've lost him for good?" Eleanor took my hand. "Then you'll survive that too, Audrey. But give him a chance to surprise you." On the 18th day after the confrontation, my phone rang. Thomas's name appeared on the screen. My hand trembled as I answered. "Hello?" "Mom." His voice sounded rough, uncertain. "Can we talk? In person?" We agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. Neutral territory. I arrived first, choosing a quiet corner table and ordering a tea I couldn't drink. When Thomas walked in, I was struck by how tired he looked, shadows under his eyes I hadn't noticed before. He sat down across from me, hands clasped tightly on the table. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "How are you?" he finally asked. "I'm okay," I replied, the inadequacy of the words hanging between us. "And you?" He shrugged, a gesture so achingly familiar it made my heart twist. "We found an apartment," he said. "Moving next week." I nodded, unsure what to say. Part of me had hoped they would somehow find a way to meet the new rent, that they wouldn't actually leave. But that had always been unlikely. "Veronica's furious," he continued, something hardening in his expression. "She wanted me to fight this legally, to challenge the rent increase, and you didn't want to?" Thomas looked down at his hands. I looked into it. "Our lawyer said you were within your rights." He hesitated. "But that's not why I'm here." I waited, heart pounding. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice low. "About how I stood by and watched. About how I did nothing." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine directly for the first time. "You were right. Whatever I had expected, it wasn't this." My throat tightened. "After you left, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about all of it. The dinner party. The way Veronica spoke to you. The way I just let it happen." His voice cracked slightly. I started remembering other things too. Comments she made. Plans that mysteriously changed when you were supposed to join us. The way she'd roll her eyes when you called. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father it made my chest ache. I knew something was wrong, but it was easier to ignore it, to pretend everything was fine. And then at some point, I started believing her narrative, that you were clingy, that you needed to give us space, that your feelings were your problem, not ours. "Thomas." "No, please, let me finish." He took a deep breath. "When you confronted, Us about the rent, about everything. At first, I was just angry. But then I asked Veronica about what you said. About her conversation in the park. She denied it at first, but when I pushed. He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. She admitted it. Not just the conversation you overheard, but all of it. The systematic way she'd been pushing you out. The little comments designed to make me see you differently. She acted like I should be impressed with her strategy. Tears were forming in his eyes now. Mom, I'm so sorry. I let this happen. I chose convenience over standing up for you. I chose peace with Veronica over treating you with the respect you deserve. The weight I'd been carrying for years seemed to shift, not disappearing entirely, but becoming somehow lighter. I played. My part too, I admitted quietly. I never set boundaries. I never spoke up. I was so afraid of losing you that I accepted treatment I shouldn't have. That doesn't excuse my behavior, he insisted. Or Veronica's. We sat in silence for a moment, the years of unspoken hurt and misunderstanding between us beginning to dissolve. So what happens now? I finally asked. Thomas looked down at his wedding ring, twisting it absently. Veronica and I, we're taking some time apart. The apartment I mentioned, it's just for me. I can't be with someone who would treat my mother that way, who would manipulate me like that. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. I never wanted to come between you and your wife. You didn't, he said firmly. She did that herself. And honestly, I'm starting to see that her treatment of you was just one symptom of larger problems between us. We talked for nearly 3 hours, peeling back layers of misunderstanding and reconnecting in a way I hadn't thought possible. When we finally parted, Thomas hugged me tightly. I'm going to do better, he promised. If you'll give me the chance. Always, I whispered. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what had once been my house, and now was again, in a way I hadn't expected. After Thomas and Veronica separated, he had moved into a small apartment across town, beginning the difficult process of disentangling his life from hers. The divorce was still ongoing, complicated by Veronica's bitterness and demands. I had rented the house to a young family, a doctor, her husband, and their 2 small children. The rent they paid, set at fair market value, had transformed my financial situation, allowing me to move into a more comfortable apartment and even set aside money for travel. Today, Thomas and I were meeting the family for the first time since they'd moved in. Their daughter, a precocious 5-year-old with braids, led us through the rooms, proudly showing us the changes they'd made. The walls were a warm yellow now. The kitchen had been updated. But somehow, the house felt more like itself than it had in years. They're taking good care of it, Thomas said as we left, the sound of children's laughter following us down the walkway. They are, I agreed. It feels like a home again. We'd developed a new routine over these months. Sunday dinners at my apartment, occasional movies, long conversations where we continued rebuilding the trust that had been damaged. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkwardness, echoes of old patterns we had to consciously break. But there was also a new honesty between us, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. I had learned to speak up when something bothered me. Thomas had learned to listen, really listen. As we walked to our cars, Thomas turned to me. I've been thinking, he said hesitantly. Maybe we could take that trip to the Grand Canyon we always talked about for your birthday next month? The trip his father and I had dreamed of, that we'd promised to take Thomas on someday. A dream that had been set aside after John died, then forgotten in the years of tiptoeing around Veronica. I smiled, feeling the warm spring sun on my face and a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. I'd like that very much, I said. As I drove home, I thought about the journey of the past year, from humiliation to confrontation to this fragile, hopeful rebuilding. I had lost some things along the way: illusions, false peace, a relationship built on unhealthy sacrifice. But I had gained something far more valuable: self-respect, true connection, and the knowledge that I was worth standing up for, even if I had to be the one to do it first. The woman who had meekly tied on that apron was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who understood that real love, whether from others or from yourself, never requires surrendering your dignity. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.